about labor market practices, policies, and reforms. It is my honor and privilege and pleasure to welcome our speakers for this track. Our keynote moderator is Professor Sarkar from IGIDR. He serves as the advisory committee of the Securities and Exchange Board of India, and he is the co-editor of the journal Macroeconomics and Finance in Emerging Economies. His field of specialization is applied econometrics, and his research has been focused in the areas of corporate governance, empirical industrial organization, and risk modeling. He has a PhD in economics from the University of California, Southern California, USA. I will move on to our next speaker and introduce her. She was there in the last panel as well. Professor Sandhya Iyer. She is the chairperson of the Center for Public Policy, Habitat and Human Development at the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute for Social Sciences. She has been a consultant for projects funded by the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP, etc. Her current empirical work focuses on sustainable development goals, both across Indian states and also among the T20 countries. Last but not the least, Dr. Radhika Kapoor, Senior Fellow ICRIER. Prior to joining ICRIER, she worked at the Planning Commission and at the International Labour Organization, Geneva. Her broad areas of research interests include poverty, inequality, labor economics, and industrial performance. Recently, Dr. Kapoor has edited a new reform paradigm festschrift in honor of Isha Judge Ahluwalia, the late Dr. Isha Judge Ahluwalia. And I thought that this would be an honorable mention at this point because ma'am was a part of many of our initiatives and activities at the School of Economics. Thank you and welcome, speakers. I request Dr. Sarkar to take over the floor.
Hello. Yeah. Okay, welcome to this session. I think it's a very, very important session, and this session, as you said, labor market practices, policies, and reforms. As students of economics, you have been writing production functions, you know, y equal to f of k and l. And then you realize that labor is a very, very important input to this production process. And with that, it starts from a micro theory of farm, but it then at the end of the day boils down to the entire country. So labor is a very, very critical input, and therefore you must have policies and reforms to encourage the use of that input very, very efficiently. So I won't dwell so much on the literature which has already established that labor market reforms and policies have a direct correlation with economic growth, and there are very, very good papers, Beasley and Burgess, for example, which is on India, and they show that difference in state regulations and reforms had a big impact on state-wise growth. So today we have two excellent speakers. I don't work in labor, but I do understand as an economist a little bit about it. So we have two excellent speakers who have worked on this field, and they have been already introduced. You can also read about them from your handout. But now you will see that in that place, the order of the speaker is written as Sandhya and then Radhika, but we will change it. We will flip it simply because Radhika would be doing more of the regulations and things like that, and Sandhya would be doing a follow-up on the implementation of the policies. So we'll have about 20 minutes. After that, I will raise my hand, and then I'll give another 5 minutes generously. And then we'll have 15 minutes for them, and then if I can think of anything intelligent to say, I will say a few lines, and after that, I will give 10 minutes to you all. And so.
PDF. Second last, yeah. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my second time. Thank you very much, Jyoti, for the invitation once again. This is just such a wonderful conference because one gets to interact. I work in a think tank, not in an academic institute, so very rarely do I get an opportunity to present to students and deconstruct the kind of work that we normally do sitting in the so-called policy think tank space and trying to make a contribution to the conversations that happen in the corridors of government. So this is really a wonderful conference for me to participate in. Also because labor regulations is a topic that I have worked on extensively over the last few years, and I've worked at it at different times. And when I sat down to put together this presentation for a student audience, some of you are undergraduate students, some masters, and some I presume PhDs, it gave me an opportunity to reflect not just on my own work that I've done on the subject, but also how the thought process and the literature has evolved on the theme of labor regulations in India, and that's really been quite exciting. So let me take you back, to the discussion that was happening in the 2000s, and that's my starting point. And I wanted to give you a bit of this historical perspective on the debate as well, and therefore I requested the chair if I could come in first. I'm guessing that all of you, when you study things like employment, industrial performance in India, you would have encountered multiple papers that talk about the role of labor regulations and the fact that it is India's so-called rigid, inflexible, pro-worker labor legislations which have actually hurt the growth of the industrial sector. They have hurt the growth of employment creation in the manufacturing sector, and so on and so forth. And this one chart that I put on top is actually from a very famous OECD report of 2007, which basically ranks countries in order of the strictness of their employment protection legislations. And what you see from here, and this is something which has been very widely cited in the literature and has been, in fact, cited repeatedly to build this narrative on why India's labor regulations need to be relaxed. This basically shows that out of all the countries that are covered in this chart, there is only one country that has more stringent regulations than India in terms of employment protection legislation. And much of this draws from one particular act, which is called the Industrial Disputes Act, in particular, Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, which perhaps some of you may have read about in the papers that you've read on labor regulations in India. And basically, this act says that if you want to retrench workers, if you're a factory with 100 or more workers and you want to lay off even one worker, you have to seek the permission of the state in which, of the government of the state in which you are operating, to actually lay off those permanent workers. And so there's been a vast body of literature which has looked at the impact of this regulation, starting from a very famous paper by Tim Besley and Robin Burgess at the LSE. Which is what the chair also referred to. And I presume you've come across that at some point in your coursework as well. So this was a very interesting, and first of it's a seminal paper which spawned a huge body of empirical work on labor regulations in India. And what Besley and Burgess did was that basically, as you know, labor is something which is on the concurrent list. So both the center and the state governments can make acts on labor. Now, in the case of the Industrial Disputes Act, there were amendments which were made by state governments over time. Now, Besley and Burgess looked at the amendments that were made by different state governments over time to the Industrial Disputes Act, and then they coded these as being either pro-worker amendments or pro-employer amendments. And then they tried to understand what was the impact of these amendments on industrial performance in that state. And what they basically found was that there was a negative impact of pro-worker regulations on output, investment, employment, and labor productivity among registered manufacturing firms. So when I'm saying registered manufacturing firms, I'm referring to what we call the formal manufacturing sector, which is captured in the annual Survey of Industries database, which again, I presume some of you have worked on. Starting with this paper, there are, if you actually, do a Google search on just the number of papers that have been written in top academic journals on India's labor regulations. I think between 2005 and 2014, there must have been at least 50 papers written which have used this index, and they have corroborated the findings of the paper, where they show that basically if your labor regulations are more pro-worker, then they are going to have an adverse impact, not just in output, employment, investment, and productivity, but also entry by new firms into your state. It's going to incentivize firms to hire more contract workers. It's going to encourage labor unrest. It is going to divert output and employment to the informal sector, where both wages and productivity are lower. And finally, all of this is going to have an adverse impact on poverty alleviation and economic growth. So, it's reasonable to say, when you look at that literature, that these pro-flexibility studies have in fact dominated the narrative on India's labor regulations. However, there has been criticism, and that, of course, has not got as much traction as the pro-flexibility studies have. Professor Aditya Bhattacharjee, who was at the Delhi School of Economics, and in fact was at this very conference in 2019, and he actually presented this very, very important paper, which I would urge anyone who's looking to work on labor regulations to read. He goes into great detail analyzing how the Besley and Burgess index was constructed. It's a very, very painstaking exercise that he's undertaken. But basically, he points several flaws with the index that they have constructed, where they do this classification of states as pro-worker or pro-employer. He says things. He points out that several of the amendments that Besley and Burgess looked at were actually completely irrelevant to this discussion on hiring and firing of labor. Some of them had only very temporary effects. All amendments were given equal weight, which of course doesn't make any sense in this context. Very few of the amendments which Besley and Burgess looked at and coded actually measured flexibility or employment protection, in the sense that they had any real impact on hiring and firing costs. And in fact, one of the things he points out is that there's obviously something wrong in the construction of their index, because states like Gujarat and Maharashtra were in fact ended up being coded as pro-worker states, while Kerala ended up being coded as a pro-employer state, which goes to contrary to any kind of intuition that we have about the labor regulatory framework in these states. Apart from technical issues about the construction of these indices, he also makes the point that there are various econometric issues in the Besley and Burgess paper, which you can go to. I mean, since I have less time, I won't elaborate, but basically their measurement errors in the index itself. There's an omitted variable bias, and of course, there's a very important thing that multiple people have found out that if in the Besley-Burgess framework, if you introduce state-specific time trends, then their results about the adverse impact of regulations disappear completely. So even that paper holds, the results get nullified when you put these state-specific time trends. Nevertheless, there are two more papers I want to talk about very briefly, which have attracted very little attention in the literature. But these papers have taken innovative approaches to look at this issue of labor regulations. One is this paper by Sarkar and Deaton, where they construct a leximetric data set. And, Deaton is at Cambridge, and they use this leximetric technique where they basically code legal changes in a manner that circumvents the methodological issues that arise when we try to code institutional and legal frameworks. And what they find is actually there is no adverse impact of these so-called pro-worker regulations on the industrial performance. Then there is another paper by Teitelbaum. This paper is, again, got very little attention in the literature, but it's extremely interesting because he actually looks at a different way of coding the amendments. And what he says that instead of understanding them as amendments which may be pro-worker or pro-employer, let's interpret them in terms of whether they actually increased or reduced the role of the government in industrial disputes. And what he actually finds, if that there is more intervention by the government, then there will actually be greater industrial investment, output, and productivity. And this, he argues, is because there is scope for mediation, for third-party mediation and settlement of grievances, and that actually provides a constructive solution instead of going for disruptive forms of protests. So the reason I presented these two slides to you is basically to show you that the discourse on labor regulations has been very, very polarized. You have this large body of work which is dominated, which tells you that we have to go more for flexibility, you need to be able to hire and fire workers. But then there is another body of work, a very careful body of work, which critiques that literature and says that, that one index which was created and has then been used by multiple papers is in fact deeply flawed, and we cannot rely on it. And the reason why this is important to highlight is because sadly a lot of the policy discourse on labor regulations in India has got anchored in the famous Besley-Burgess paper and the papers that followed thereafter, and has been repeatedly used to relax labor regulations, as we have seen, especially over the course of the last 5-6 years. Now, beyond the criticism of this index, I mean, this was a technical issue which I thought would be of interest to students. There is this larger question of, what do these regulations actually do on the ground? While on paper they might be interpreted as being highly inflexible or rigid, Professor Shyam Sundar, again, he also presented at the last FECO conference, he calls these regulations as being paper tigers. But in fact, on the ground, they are very, very flexible. And so there is the issue of there is de jure rigidity, but de facto flexibility. And in some of my own work, I have highlighted that basically, given this de jure rigidity, what firms have done over the years is that they have basically come up with different management strategies to actually circumvent regulations. So if you actually look at the period between 2000, 2015, 16, where I analyzed the registered manufacturing data set, what you find is that employment has in fact grown in the organized manufacturing sector. Of course, I mean, it has not grown to the extent that we need to in terms of job creation. So it's clearly fallen short of that target, but it has grown. And what is striking is that most of that employment growth has actually come from the growth of contract workers and not workers who are directly on the payrolls of the company. So for example, between 2000 and 2016, over 50% of the employment growth that's happened in the registered manufacturing sector has actually come from contract workers. And you can actually see that in the panel that is there on the left-hand side, which looks at the distribution of the workers by employment type. And interestingly, what I've also found in this work is that in this process, I mean, if labor regulations were in fact that rigid and that inflexible, and they were just protecting these, what is called in the data directly hired workers, which we can very loosely proxy and say, okay, it's the closest we've got in the data to tell us something about what permanent workers or permanent employees are. Their real wages have in fact been stagnant for this entire period. I mean, they haven't grown at all. And in fact, firms have increasingly used more contract workers to circumvent labor regulations, not just to circumvent the labor regulations, but in fact to suppress the bargaining power of the rest of the workforce. Because by having this alternative workforce, which can be used strategically to their advantage to suppress the demands of their union, they have actually been able to hurt both the directly hired workers and the contract workers. And in the process, it's not as if any of the workers have in fact benefited. So there is this issue of contractualization, the fact that the wages of the workers, especially the directly hired workers, has not gone up. The other issue, of course, is that what we have seen increasingly is there is outsourcing of activities which is happening to the informal, the unregistered data, to the sector. Now, the informal sector, by the way, is like a very heterogeneous sector. When we say informal sector, the first thing that comes to our mind is actually the self-employed, the own account enterprises. Now, of course, some of the outsourcing which has happened from the formal sector to the informal sector is to home-based workers also. But a large number of them are simply unregistered units. And these are fairly productive units, but these have been pushed into the informal sector because these are, again, strategies which have been used by firms in the formal sector to circumvent regulations. And then, of course, there is the final point, which is a point which is not in my work, but again, Professor Shyam Sundar makes from his surveys, is that very often, what firms are doing is that they're changing the legal status of the worker so that he is no longer in a bargaining position. Instead of saying that he's actually a worker, like a production worker, as we see in the SI data, they're promoted to what is called a supervisory or a managerial cadre, so that they're no longer in that position to bargain. And then, of course, there are apprentices and trainees who are used for regular work. And that's where also, the sort of misuse of the Apprenticeship Act happens, which was referred to by Professor Ritu Devan. So, it's quite sad state of affairs, because we have this de facto flexibility, but this de facto flexibility has also, hurt the interests of the workers, and at the same time, it has also been blamed for hurting the growth of the industrial sector. Now, in the recent past, in 2014, there were a number of state governments which actually started making changes to some of the key acts that are there. For example, Rajasthan was the first state which amended the Industrial Disputes Act. So what it did was that it increased the threshold of the firms to which the Industrial Disputes Act would apply from 100 to 300 workers. For Factories Act, it increased the threshold from 10 to 20 and 20 to 40. And for Contract Labor Act, it did it from 20 to 50. And these, there's several states which have followed suit. And of course, like I said, the motivation for a lot of these labor legislative reforms is in fact coming from this huge body of pro-flexibility studies which have argued that increasing these thresholds, relaxing these labor regulations will spur the growth of employment and industry in the states. And this is, based on some work that I'm doing at the moment. It's far from over, but I nevertheless thought I'll present some of these results. So basically, to explain it very simply, what we try to do over here, and this is work that I'm doing with a co-author at Duke, we basically tried to use the difference in difference technique to understand, to compare states where the amendments to these acts were made, all three of these amendments which were made together, with states where the amendments were not made, and then try to understand if there was any difference in their performance, in their industrial performance post these amendments. So, for example, we looked at the state of Rajasthan, and Rajasthan, the amendments were made in 2014-15. All three amendments happened together. And we compare this with the state of Jharkhand, and we've done it for multiple other states. I'm just showing, oh, you have just 5 minutes. Okay, so let me not go into the details here. What I'll say here is that, so basically we tried to use this difference in difference technique to understand if there was any impact. And we've looked at a whole set of states together. Now, what we basically find typically is that there is no significant impact of these amendments on employment, on number of man days worked by workers at the plant level. In one or two instances, we find that 2 to 3 years after the amendment, there is some small positive effect which is there on employment after the amendment was introduced. But that seems to be happening only in those states which already had a very good industrial climate, in those states where anyway the entire enabling architecture for industry to perform was in place. So there are two things which are coming out from this analysis, which would perhaps be of interest at this point. One is that the role of labor regulations is far more modest than the intensity of the debate suggests. Because again, like I said, if you go to the literature, you'll feel that everything that is wrong with India's industrial manufacturing sector has to do with our labor regulatory framework. This empirical analysis suggests that this is far from the case. The second thing it tells us is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the performance across states, and this heterogeneity has to do with the remaining ecosystem that you have in place for the growth of the manufacturing sector. So here I would argue that basically, we need to stop putting the blame on labor regulations for hurting the growth, and to my mind, it is a red herring in this entire discourse on the manufacturing sector. However, having said this, what I want to highlight, and this is where I think, Sandhya will have a lot of things to say as well, is that the current status quo has hurt workers enormously. Because what it's done is that it has led to firms circumventing regulations and creating jobs which are not good jobs, which are not decent work. So there has been a deterioration in the quality of work, both in terms of access to social security and your contract duration. Now, this is a table which is constructed from the employment unemployment surveys. What I've shown you so far is work I've done from the ASI, but this is from the NSS and the PLFS. And what we've tried to track is that basically what has happened to the quality of regular salaried work in India over this period, where it is apparently the case that stringent labor regulations, the regulations are very stringent and give too much protection to workers. So what you see over here actually is that if you look at the share of regular salaried workers who have access to just one social security benefit, these are called regular formal workers, or the ILO calls them regular protected employment. That statistic has not changed very much. It's just about 42%. But if you look at this pool of regular formal workers or regular protected employment and then dissect it more carefully by, what are the best contracts within this category of regular protected employment, what you find is that there is a very, very sharp deterioration. For contracts which we call best contracts, so they give you access to all possible social security benefits. If you look at the table which is on the bottom left, there's been a decline from about 60% to 44%. So within the group of regular protected or regular formal workers, the share of best contracts has fallen by about 15 percentage points. And on the other hand, if you look at the share of contracts in again this pool of regular protected employment, which have no written job contract, that number has gone up by 10 percentage points from 25 to 35%. And this is really quite striking. And that Noman, who is at the ILO, who's also done some of the initial work on this, he calls it the hollowing out of regular protected employment in India. And this hollowing out happening at a time when we're arguing that labor regulations are giving too much protection, to my mind, makes absolutely, I can't reconcile the two. And the fact remains that despite all this so-called rigidity and inflexibility, dualism very much remains the defining characteristic of India's labor market. If you look at the table, the chart that's on the right, what you see that over this entire period of time, when India has witnessed very rapid economic growth, and that of course raises the question of what that economic growth means and what it's actually capturing, the fact remains that over 90% of employment remains informal. However, what has happened is that within that pool of informal employment, because informal employment comprises of two things, it comprises of employment which is in the informal sector, plus those who are informally employed in the formal sector. So while we have seen some slight decline in the share of employment in the informal sector, which is the orange bars that you see in the graph, the share of the employment in the informal sector has gone down from about 89.8 to 83%. Concomitantly, what you have seen is that the share of informal employment in the formal sector has gone up. And that is, all the circumvention of regulations through various management practices that are happening. And as a result of it, dualism is still very much prevalent. It is only changing its shape and form. So we are seeing enterprises getting slightly formalized, and that, of course, is likely to continue to keep happening given the policy push that is there towards formalization, given the push towards, given the introduction of GST, digitalization, and so on. But that informalization is still very much there in terms of the nature of the job contract in the formal sector. So, I think the way I look at it, again, like I said, I worked on this for a while, and I've basically, having also used the Besley-Burgess Index in my earlier work, I feel like too much of the discourse on labor in India has focused on just the issue of flexibility, just the issue, okay, and just the issue of hire and fire. But I think we need to really rethink what we mean by these labor reforms, because we have these new four new codes, the Code on Occupational Safety, the Code on Wages, Industrial Relation Code, Social Security Code, and this is all emanating from the recommendations which were made by the Second National Commission on Labor. And again, there a lot of that discussion happened in the context of flexibility, the fact that there were too many laws, there was need for simplification, harmonization, nationalization, so on and so forth. I feel that there's a need that we need to really rethink this whole architecture of labor, in the sense that this whole existing framework of labor regulations thinks of labor as a mere factor of production whose cost has to be reduced. We need to understand that labor is not like any other factor of production. Labor, in fact, is human capital which we need to invest in if we want to enhance the productivity of our firms. And again, I'm showing you this graph. It might not make this table on the right, which might just appear out of the blue over here. But again, it's from my previous work on contract workers, where we actually show that directly hired workers do have higher productivity compared to contract workers. So if you also want to enhance firm productivity, it is important to invest in your labor. And the accumulation of firm specific human capital is something which we don't attach any importance to. If we keep having these contracts, like even fixed term contracts which have been introduced now, where we engage somebody for 3 to 4 months, then we give them a break, then after 6 months, then the precarity which is there in the contract disincentivizes you to invest in education, to invest in skills, apart from the fact that these kind of contracts give you lower wages than regular jobs, but also the fact that they hurt firm productivity, because they don't encourage you to invest in firm specific human capital. So I would, though I have 2-3 more slides I wanted to show, but I would conclude by saying that I think, one, we need to rethink how we think of labor in this discussion or in the labor regulatory framework. The second is that given that informalization is taking many new shapes and forms. One is the informalization that we see in the formal sector. The second is this issue of gig work, which is attracting so much attention. Given that this session was placed in the context of SDG 8, how are we going to bring decent work to those who are informally employed? Because who will bear the cost of creating those good jobs? And this is also related to the discussion that happened in the last session about, I'm a small firm, how can I bear the cost of hiring these women, giving them maternity benefits, and so on. There is a positive social externality to having a good job. And the private entrepreneur, the MSME, can certainly not bear the cost of that. So how do we fund social security to bring decent work, especially to informal workers, is something we need to think about. And I think that's hopefully something Sandhya will touch on. So thank you.
So, as we set this up, I think Radhika has given a very tall task. I thought only Professor Jyoti gave me tough questions. I think Dr. Radhika added 3 more to my bucket list to answer. And I think 20 minutes is not being fair if we talk about equity over here, but I think I'll try to deal with that 20-minute option. Thank you and good afternoon. And I think the pre-lunch last talk, I would try to keep it as engaging as the eminent speakers who have been doing since morning. And thanks, Professor Jyoti, for inviting me to this very important discussion with young minds. I think what is going on right now? We are also seeing the Davos World Economic Forum throwing out statements about how India is the rising, emerging economy with investment attracting spaces, right? Yeah? And we are also hearing statements about how India could possibly be an alternate industrial hub if China continues to lag, isn't it? These are the headlines you keep reading every other day. Does it really trigger an interest about what Professor Sarkar said, production function? The entire dilemma that we are talking about in the 21st century today is about what capital can do for growth. At no point are we talking about the second dimension of the Cobb-Douglas function, which is labor, right? And that's the point of worry, particularly when I was your age. I was told that we are getting into an era of demographic dividend. And we were told that the moment IT boom takes place, Indian workforce who are skilled are going to get absorbed. I'm not trying to paint a dismal picture. I'm not trying to argue that that's not occurred. And I'm not trying to say that that will never happen. But the fact remains, the fact that when you have scholars like Santosh Mehrotra talking about burgeoning numbers of unemployed, educated youth, and the PLFS throwing data sets where the youth are not getting employed, and Professor Alak Sharma has written about the same, I think there's a lot to be looked into. While we have been speaking a lot about the nature of what employment conditions are all about, I think I'm taking a little step backwards, and I want to question and understand whether this is also an end of social security, the end of era of social security. Okay, and not to again state that we can't think differently, but the fact is that when you look at the questions which were put forth, okay, a very important point which we need to keep in mind is that, do we realize the context that we are sitting in? We are talking about a situation where we are just coming out of perhaps the shadow of the pandemics, and if I were to look at what's going on in China today, maybe the 4th wave is coming to the corner. And if that's the case, can economic recovery be factored in without looking into those dimensions? And again, we look at the question which Oxfam just released in the 2023 report. which has clearly highlighted that during this pandemics and during the Russia-Ukraine crisis, oil-producing companies and food production companies have expanded their wealth exponentially, such that over the past 2 years, the world's super rich 1% have gained nearly twice as much wealth as the remaining 99%. So we can't blink our eye to the reality of inequality anymore. And you were asking about the inverted U shape. I think let's place everything in context. They also have argued that at least 1.7 billion workers live in countries where inflation is outpacing their wage growth, even as billionaire fortunes are rising by 2.7 billion a dollar. And that's where I want you to connect to the point which Professor Ritu Diwan was talking about, what happens when the state withdraws food subsidies. What happens to the working classes whose nominal incomes have declined in the last 3 years, right? So these are the clear points, and the question which I would like to therefore answer in the next 15 minutes in my capacity as a researcher is, can we just isolate the labor market questions completely and forget to look at the second pillar, which is more crucial from the perspective of labor well-being, which is the provision of social security? And what are the constituents that we need to look at? So let's look at the scorecard we have been given at this point by the 2023 World Economic and Social Report by the ILO. Job gap, about 470, I'm talking about global numbers, don't get scared. This is not just India, but India is part of the larger bucket over here. 473 million want jobs, of which active job seekers are about 280 million. So again, connecting to what Professor Deshpande was speaking, people who are coming for the labor market but are not getting jobs. Look at the gender gap. Twice as many women as men are outside the labor force, not because they don't want to get in, but they don't have any space. No education, employment, and trading, 23.5% youth are in this category. Informal sector jobs, as Radhika was saying, is gone beyond a point. In fact, I'm reminded of a very fascinating article by Keith Hart in the EPW, End of Dualism. We have normalized informal sector to the extent of 97%. Is it still dual? Can we still call ourselves a dual labor? Right? Our labor markets have become extremely visibly unipolar in the context of informality. And in fact, we have become a practicing laboratory of informality in the world. And if this were the case, and we look at the global labor incomes, if you look at it, the bottom 50% workers are earning only 8% of the total labor income. This takes me to a very interesting, I think you should reach page 6 of the Sir Beveridge Committee report on social insurance. It's available on the net, okay? You can search it, you will find it. And in the 6th page, he quotes that if you were to look at social security not strictly as a provision to provide elementary contingency protection, he has actually given a very interesting coin called freedom from want. When we are talking about freedom from want, he's not arguing that whether it should be subsistence, whether it should be maintenance, whether it should be skills. It's about contextualizing within the larger developmental reality. And I think the current developmental reality of the 21st century is not just about whether the worker is safe in the factory site or in the enterprise. What's happening to him or her, or his or her, as it's called these days, outside of it. The precarious conditions, the living conditions that they're surviving also need to be factored in. So the guiding principle which was provided for in the Beveridge report talks about this. Should not be restricted to consideration of sectional interests established in obtaining that experience. Now that the war is abolishing landmarks of every kind, it's an opportunity for us to experience it in a clear field. And therefore, when we are trying to recoin the importance of social protection, which is what Professor Ravi Srivastava has been skatingly writing extensively about, we need to understand, how do I approach the idea of social security? Whether it is only about providing out-of-the-pocket expenses or opportunities such as ma'am was talking about LICs, where we have to go and procure, or is there a role of social relationships? It's about a social contract that we are discussing. And currently, if you look at it, the very concept of social security immediately takes our imagination to the formal sector, to the organized sector. We are unable to even imagine what could happen to the large informal workers who are working around us. And they're around us every other day, right? From the vegetable vendors to the Swiggy deliveries coming to your campuses every other day. So what worked for the advanced countries as an idea of protection, as a social security concept, is it relevant for the developing countries like India? And we are imagining ourselves to grow further. There's again a rich body of work since the 1990s. A very interesting book published by the Oxford University Press on social security for developing countries, having about 20 odd grand articles trying to say, how do I realize the idea of a broader connotation where persistent poverty, persistent nutritional deprivation, lack of education, skills, and nutrition can be dealt with, and how do you make social security relevant? And I think the definition given by John Dress and Amartya Sen in the volume talks about the need to pursue social security through public means to include promotional measures as well, not just protective. What is the difference between the two? When we are talking about protective, if I meet with an accident, I get a compensation from my employer because we are paid. Okay, but when we are saying promotional, I'm being supported to get it, getting education, getting health care, getting housing systems, etc., etc. So when we look at the larger point, and again I draw on Ravi Srivastava sir's very excellent paper on social protection floors, where he says that the term social floor and social protection floor has been used to mean a set of basic social rights. We need to start looking at labor rights. And at a time when labor market institutions are crumbling in front of our eyes and we find that trade unions are not finding their space, who entitles them? Who gives them those rights? Let's look at the broader picture and the canvas that we have at this point in time. On the one hand, the light blue set of points are what the governments ought to be doing: running an excellent fiscal policy, public spending programs, managing inflation control policies, and looking at redistribution of resources and do what they're supposed to do, spend for us. And on the other hand, we also imagine that the markets, which is the capitalist order that we are living in, will be also looking at enhancing productivity, focusing on research and development, innovation, and investment. But the integral part of social security is this question of what was imagined to be the promotional category and what are protective. In the promotional social security, we are talking about what all types of activities, including setting up of minimum wages, fixing in the employment conditions, and that's what Radhika eloquently put it up. The moment you take away the Industrial Disputes Act and you start exploiting working conditions, what kind of jobs have got created? If I may use the word of dirty jobs, yes, because they're not decent anymore, right? On the other hand, we're talking about provisioning of education, health, water supply, sanitation as elementary entitlements for all. And when we're talking about the Social Security ILO convention, why I wanted to flag it as an ILO convention, this is what you will find in the organized sector. The moment I get a job, I will be entitled for 7 types of provisions, including skill reproduction and training and other things, right? Social assistance, on the other hand, is a direct benefit transfer kind of programs where governments are going to be providing for direct funds to vulnerable groups. Okay, so the old age pension schemes, widow pension scheme programs which are there are part of the assistance. So it's a cash transfer which takes place. Let's compare the two connotations. Again, I'm just going to keep it elementary. I'm not going to deepen it to make your life difficult. What is the idea of social in the social security? Basically, it is about representing a form of a social contract. Social contract, in case of the beverage idea, would be a relationship between the employer and the employee. If what, in fact, Radhika's data set shows, 44% workers do not even have a written contract in India. There falls the first condition of a social, right? And when we follow higher and higher, we lost that relationship there. So that constituent of social security has become invisible there for you. So all of it rests in the hands of workers. Let's look at the second data. 56% of our workers are either self-employed or they're part of home-based enterprises. So it's all within that household to determine how they want to look at their income and employment securities, right? So if I would have followed a typical ILO kind provisioning or social security, about 97% will not be entitled for any of those constituents. Let's look at the expanded connotation. What is social here? When we are talking about the need to move towards socio-economic security frameworks, we are putting a significant responsibility in the hands of the state, the governments. Government runs social insurance programs, social assistance programs, direct benefit programs, public spending per se, and food subsidy as well. Over here, there's a relationship between the government and the worker. So Mandrega is a classic example, where government is the employer. Workers are being engaged in that, okay? If you look at government with vulnerable groups, you're talking about direct cash transfers. So the role of the state cannot be ignored. And that's exactly what even Beveridge Committee report spoke about. That we are not trying to highlight it as an emphasis that only a firm is responsible for social security. When capitalism entrenches itself in this format, you expect the state to take charge of people's lives and well-being. And that's the reason why we need to look at the second dimension of the question which was specified. How do we align our labor market reforms to our social security reforms? How do we really connect ourselves better? Where are we in the 21st century? We are sitting in a situation when we are just coming out of a pandemic, and there is a war which is never going to, I don't want to give that judgment. I'm not a forecaster. I don't see the war ending. And what is it really going to do to me? I'm constantly going to face natural disasters, health uncertainties are going to be there, which is directly impacting my demographic balance. I cannot predict what my future workforce is going to look like and what is going to be the composition of that particular change. Life expectancy, though improving due to quality of healthcare, does not guarantee transformation. Economic uncertainty, on the other hand, is visibly creating not only conflicts across countries, we are finding unrest. What's Brazil experiencing today? There are two groups on the streets fighting with each other, trying to see what kind of transformations they're looking at, right? We are seeing this across the board. Sri Lanka, right? So conflicts of various forms are there. Inequalities are not just about saying whether quantitatively there's visible inequalities. There are visible inequities, and we're transferring across generations. And there's some exceptional works which are going on the intergenerational mobility of jobs. I think that literature will be useful. And as per the as per the ILO's latest reports, working poor has increased significantly in the last 3 years. So poverty is visible. If I now like to look at these two templates and try to look at the 2 centuries that have gone by us, I think it's high time we change the definition of social security, not just in case of freedom from want, because I think that has made our life too commodified, right? We're trying to chase utilities forever. I think we need to start talking about towards ecological stability. Look at Joshimath. It was way back in 1990s that we had already mentioned that the NTPC project should not be located there. There were reports given to the government, and the R&R projects which were done by our institute have clearly mentioned not to do. But look at the reality that's happened to us. So if we do not look at the ecological conditions, and we know ecology is a global public good, is a national public good, the role of the state becomes relevant here, right? And if we do not deal with persistent well-being and persistent, or rather don't look at impoverishments, we know what is going to have to happen to societies as we move on. That makes my matrix even more complicated. Let's try to bring these two things together and see what do we do to deal with Anthropocene? How do I address economic uncertainty to provide social security for you, me, and everyone here? And the point that becomes real is that now markets are no longer worried about productivity. They are no longer just worried about innovation and invention, which is what our entrepreneurs are getting into, right? Startup India, Stand-up India, etc., etc. They are now more worried about commodity prices, energy security. They are more worried about how do we deal with the problem of value chains. That's the new globalization problem. And therefore, they're not worried about whether jobs are going to get created here. In some of our works that we did on impact assessments on food security in India and Africa, we found that though we are eating the pulses and lentils here, they are not produced here alone. We are importing it from multiple regions. So the labor over there is getting exploited, and we are consuming commodities over here. We are no longer just worried about whether the apparels come to our country. Those apparels are having a huge value chain which is impacting us. And I think this economic uncertainty has demonstrated that we are not industrialized enough. We have not privatized enough. I'm not talking about privatization of PSUs, but the private sector has not grown enough. And if that's the reality, let's look at the complexity today. We are talking at a situation where governments have to now start allocating significant amounts on ecological security. They need to invest much more on environmental resilience and recovery. They need to start focusing more on living conditions. And I think that's what Government of India is also focusing on, moving away from minimum wages to living wages. But what is the definition? I'll just come to that in a while. So that's the huge built up to what I wanted to talk. Let's look at the Indian context, therefore. I think the Constitution of India has made it very, very clear that every constituent of social security or socioeconomic security is embedded in that. And the directive principles have also laid out the center-state relationships eloquently well. So even if we are not signatories of 102 ILO convention, our governments have to give us as a right. We have a plethora of schemes and programs. In fact, the day before yesterday in one of my classes, I just asked my students, do you have any clue how many poverty alleviation schemes are being implemented in India on a particular day? Just for poverty alleviation across states. You have about 1,700 schemes only for poverty alleviation. Now, I'm not talking about skill development. I'm not talking about social assistance programs. We keep imagining schemes as a solutions to problems and not addressing problems with the mechanism of spending. So we do have a lot of things happening, and I won't take too much of your time over here. I think Professor Ritu Diwan was saying how the Social Security Code does not define workers, but it has defined categories of social security, and it deals with a string of legislations related to income, health, employment, provident fund, and this is meant according to the legislation for all. Okay, so if you look at it, and then what are the data systems telling me? Since 2017 to 2018 to September 2021, I've gone till 22, okay? It's as recent as I could deep dive. You do find that over a period of time, now the number of beneficiaries, and this is what Government of India keeps saying, that the formal sector has increased, not on the basis of the job contracts, but on the basis of people who have enrolled in the EPF. In the last 5 years, it has increased by about 461% according to the registrations that have gone in. But fascinatingly, I would like to draw your attention to this last column here, which says minus 33.50. Basically, the number of establishments who are now remitting funds have come down. So though there are numbers in terms of quantity, you find significant number of workers getting registered, the enterprises remitting is not going in hand over there. And what is equally interesting is that in the age group of 18 to 35, you do find significant number of EPF beneficiaries who are got registered. So they all have, in principle, the card for social protection. In terms of numbers, yeah. So if I look at the ESICs, which is the Employment State Insurance Scheme, which basically takes care of occupational health, we do find between 2017 and 18, that is the blue line, and the gray line is 2022-23, we do see that the coverage has again increased from 40 million to 45 million, which is something changing somewhere in the crust somewhere. Let's look at what is it really doing undercurrents. What are the undercurrents there? While the coverage from the 18 to 35 age group has gone up, the female to male ratio, that is number of women who are getting registered and getting ESIs and EPF cards, is to the extent of 1,800 females to 1 man. And that's a very scary number, which means though the women are in the enterprises, though they are registered workers, we find that the practices are not going as per the forms of equality. There are vast state-level disparities. Again, the front-running industrial states such as Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu, you will find significant number of enrollments. And the other regions, which is if you look at the tertiary sector burgeoning regions, we find that the proportion of EPF and ESIS beneficiaries are significantly lower. Let's look at what's coming along due to the Social Security Code, and last 3 more slides perhaps. If I look at the eShram data, which talks about provision, what I try to look at is what is the sectoral composition. I think this is all in public domain. I'm not giving new stories over here. My story comes later. Agricultural laborers have enrolled in large numbers, about 52.2%, followed by domestic and household workers who are also, so let me tell you, even over here, there's a difference which I will take you through it. When you're seeing these numbers, let's take it with a pinch of salt. Were they registering, or were they made to register, or were the cards getting created? That requires to be picked up. Of course, over here, what was heartening for me as a researcher is just to go with an intuition, perhaps more women are got registered with an eShram card. At least the card has reached them. I don't know whether they're going to be getting the labor identity from there. And pardon me for the map over here. There are 2 things that have happened. In the last 8 months, the registration numbers have gone up significantly. Okay? And as of 2023, January, you have 285.14 million workers who have registered on the portal. Okay, and here you have a distinct poverty linkage visible. What is a poverty linkage? If you look at the darker states, okay, you have Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, followed by Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, where you find the enrollments are significantly high. Okay, almost. Thank you, sir. Yeah. And if I look at the self-registration, so self-registration happens at 2 points. One, I can do it on my own sitting on a laptop system, or I can use the so-called Umang app, which was created on the mobile. Remember Umang that happened during COVID for all of us? Workers can use that as well. And again, over here, you find Uttar Pradesh, because by the very absoluteness of number of workers in the state, you find them dominating. But several states, it's not really taken off. And it's a fundamental problem there. Since in neoliberal era, we are used to hear words like multi-stakeholder, and in TIS we use that very often, multi-stakeholder processes. Typically, the eShram framework also uses a multi-stakeholder framework where you have the labor department and 8 other departments running the show. And in the implementation process, you have labor legislation, labor facilitation centers, states seva kendras, self-registration, so on and so forth, okay? Now let's look at where is the fulcrum or the nucleus of the problem. The same labor department which could not go and do labor inspections of factory sites has been entrusted the right to look at all the data, to validate it, to provide the labor unique ID, which will guarantee them. The number of people who have got the labor numbers assigned to them is just about 1.5%. So they're not really able to, so though we have digitized a structure with the best platforms, the department which requires greater strengthening, which is getting only 0.08% of public spending to its allocation, is not really having the capability to do it. So where are we? We are in the cyclical trap once again. We have a federal mismatch where the center is trying to assign a certain concept. You have multiple states organizing themselves in various formats with some sort of competition. Benchmarks are different, overlapping universes, unequal systems, a whole range of things coming back to the eShram point. And the validation processes which I just mentioned stems from the very basic point. UPI, Aadhaar card not there, telephones not connected, KYC is not connected to banks. The workers themselves who have written, there are several voices which you will find, which says that my mother had the Aadhaar card and I didn't have. And to make my own Aadhaar, I had to pay money, for which they wanted the social security processes done. So the entire process that's happening is that while there is a gap about the whole concept of social security and the framework in which we are getting going with all these transformations, we find that even migrant workers, which again is a fundamental point, I think we need to really learn from how Kerala managed to universalize social security for the migrant workers. I think we need to draw from within before we start drawing out. Only 3% of the eShram registrations are from migrant workers. So let's come back to the third question that was posed to me. How does it look at it when I look at it from the SDGs lens? Basically, all governments are supposed to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems for all, including flows for reducing and preventing social security. And then you have SDG 3.8, 5.4, 8.5, and 10.4. I'm not reading them up. It's available. And we have to look at social security as a human right. If we look at it further, the devil lies in the details. SDG's focus is continuing to be on the contingency. The moment I use contingency, kindly recall it is the protective ILO kind. We are still again going back to the old frameworks of provisioning with mixed contributory schemes which are there. And therefore, everything comes back to the point of out of the pocket. If the worker is able to feel that he is having the capacity to contribute, can he protect himself? And during COVID-19 pandemic, most of them have become ineligible for health insurance because they've all got comorbidities. Okay? Therefore, when we look at this entire point and we look at the World Social Protection Report, again, the numbers are here for us to see. 35% children are left out of social protection, which is what even UNICEF talks about. 41% of mothers receive maternal benefits. Only 22% of unemployed are covered under any benefits, and there are certain very interesting examples of Rajasthan, which I'd like to say if I'm given about 20 or extra seconds, 20 seconds more. I was sitting in a ministerial meeting in Delhi, trying to discuss how do you shape the social SDG frameworks on social protection. And in Rajasthan, they had started providing direct transfer programs for unemployed. And there was members in the department who were trying to say, अब इनसे और क्या काम करवा सकते हैं, इनको तो पैसे दे दिए, कहीं भाग जाए तो. What were they trying to say? If I'm giving you some money, instead of trying to seek jobs in the markets, the state is trying to take them into schools and colleges to check the accounts and other things. So it's very fascinating. Taking you out of the data because it's almost lunchtime, I thought this picture tells it all for India. The internally displaced person struggling for basic needs due to climate change in the last 15 years has increased significantly, and this is an invisible crisis. And that's where the Anthropocene problem needs to be aligned with the labor market and the social security policies for our country particularly. At the end of 2021, there were over 59 million people who were forcefully displaced within their own countries due to conflict. And this I'm quoting the UNDP report, Turning the Tide on Internal Displacement, a development approach to solutions. If all these contexts are going to get fragile, and if you look at social security not just as an additionality of spending, not just as an additionality as a burden, but as a way in which we would like to look after ourselves and our framework and our society, we need to first change the acronyms of what incomes are. We need to move away from just talking about minimum wages to real wages. We need to start talking about food security as a permanent entity. Because with every crisis, we are going to be pushing many more households below the poverty line due to lack of access to food security. There are distinct or rather disjoint strategies for industrial policies, employment policies, all speaking in silos. And social security becomes like an add-on component. We don't see them as an embedded approach. And more critically, since we have now moved into the low middle income category, and perhaps by the time you graduate and grow, we may become middle income. I wish you all the best. We need to change up here BPL norms from $1.9 a day to at least $4 a day. And that means our minimum wages need to get scaled up. Yeah, done. Last 2 points. And if you look at the vision, even labor markets, as I mentioned, continue to be the weak link, and we need to understand the gendered approach to analysis to get back women into the labor force. And we need to look at mechanisms where we can take registrations further. So at the end of the point, when we're saying SDGs is about no one left behind, today workers are all left behind. I think we need to scale that into our discussions in everyday spaces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both Sandhya and Radhika for some two excellent presentations. I thought I will say something, but I will not say. What I shall rather do is I will allow 3 questions. I'll allow 3 questions depending on how long the questions is. I will speak after that. So who wants to ask any question?
Hello. Good afternoon, esteemed panelists. So I'm Sudan Arial, first year MSc student at Symbiosis School of Economics. So as the topic of Cobb Douglas production function was brought about, so there is this thing in economic theory, like in the production function, where labor is treated, as you said, like a mere input for production, and which should, if our conditions for efficiency demand, should be easily substituted by capital. But it seems to miss out an important fact that labor is actually human, but capital is, well, mere capital. And this sort of moral void in economic theory has also been held responsible by many to be the leading cause for the skyrocketing inequality of income, wealth, and opportunities all around the world, which has in turn shaken the very foundations of the democratic political system itself. So how do you think this situation can be reconciled, and to what extent do you think our preferences for fairness, equity, be allowed to make compromises in the conditions for efficiency? Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon. So I just wanted to ask this. This is a general question. So could it be that the rigidity in labor laws be one of the reasons that it is actually harming the laborers instead? For example, like you already mentioned that if an institution or an has more than 100 employees, then it needs to get permission from the state government if it wants to lay off one or other one or more employees. Furthermore, there is also another law which states that if the management wants to change uh, the kind of work assigned to the labor worker, so they also have to seek permission for that. And then there is another law which is the law about uh, trade unions, which basically says that seven or more people can form trade unions. So and the problem with trade unions is that these trade unions can also have competing ideas and possessions. So could these laws actually be harming the labor force instead of benefiting them? So that was my question. Thank you.
I am Arukyam from St. Joseph's College, Trichy. My question is, would MSME would act as an enabler for employment generation?
Okay. Thank you for the excellent questions. I'm not even going to say that I can, really answer the first question, but I completely agree with what you're saying, and that's basically the point that I was trying to make as well. When you start studying economic theory, you look at that Cobb-Douglas production function, you straight away think of L as being that factor of production, and like you said, there is this moral void. You put it very nicely, I think, and you need to think through, what is, it's not a mere factor of production. It's much more than that. I think that, what happens, even when you look at it in a macroeconomic framework, is too much of this discussion about labor enters only from the production side. What we forget is that on the other side, the consumer and the demand is also coming from that labor only. If we give, and that's all there in our frameworks, but in the policy discourse, it doesn't get that kind of attention. Because also, if you look at a lot of our policy prescriptions, everything is coming and being seen. I mean, all the solutions that we get, we are seeing supply side, right? We're not tackling the problems that are on the demand side. I mean, perhaps on some level, we're in denial of the demand side problems. But labor is essentially entering on the demand side as well also. It is where the demand in the economy is going to come from. So when you have things like, suppression of bargaining power of labor, because of which their real wages don't rise. Separately, you have data on agricultural wages. There's Himanshu Ajenu, who's shown that real wages of agricultural workers have been flat since 2014. All of that has then had implications for consumption expenditure, which is evident in the national account statistics as well. And look, where is the growth in the Indian economy anyway going to come from? We know that investment has been declining since 2010. I mean, there's been a slight uptick in recent times. Some of it might be driven just by schemes like PLI, but that's not going to drive growth. The world is heading towards a recession. External demand is not going to be a driver of growth. In any case, we have not been an export-led economy. So domestic demand consumption is going to be very important. If we keep thinking of labor as that mere factor of production, even in our macroeconomic framework, when we design policies, there will be no demand. And where is growth going to come from? And also, the same thing comes in on this technology debate of the substitutability. You see, there is rapid technological change happening. There is this increasing fear that unskilled labor is going to be replaced. And of course, there is that polarized middle over there as well. But then again, at some point, if machines are going to come in and substitute labor, labor share in national income is going to keep falling, where is the aggregate demand in the economy going to come from? So, I would say that even on a macroeconomic perspective, it's there, it's in our frameworks, but for some reason it's not adequately captured. On the second question, yes, I think that, and again, that was the point that I was trying to make, that the so-called pro-worker regulations, this rigidity and inflexibility, which is stemming from being pro-worker, as they say, has not served the interests of workers at all. So, in fact, it is important to rethink this framework and stop thinking of it as pro-worker and pro-employer, and think of it, frame the debate only in the context of the flexibility, but in fact frame the debate in the context of labor being more than that factor of production, but also being an integral part of both your production and consumption process. On the side of MSMEs, I think that, um, can MSMEs be the engines of job growth? I think there a lot will have to be done for that to actually happen, because the larger enterprises, they are definitely more capital intensive in nature. They not only operate in capital intensive sectors, but even in sectors where they are in labor intensive industries, they use far more capital than labor. And there's again data from the ASI which shows that across all industries, you can go down to the 4-digit level as well, the capital intensity of production has been rising. MSMEs, use more labor intensive techniques of production, and therefore my sense is that this is where the jobs will have to come from. But whether they will come or not is a different issue, because not only is the MSME sector just reeling under the impact of demonetization and the introduction of GST and then COVID, all of which has borne a disproportionate impact, but also rising protectionism. One of the biggest challenges that MSMEs are facing, and because I'm doing a survey on MSMEs, one is constantly hearing about how they are finding it so difficult to access key inputs at reasonable prices because of rising protectionism, and that's hurting them. So I think a lot will have to be done. Cluster development, policies on that front, access to finance. Again, there are initiatives like account aggregate and all, but we will have to do a lot more for them to actually become engines of job creation.
That's one side of the quantum issue that we should be worried about. But at the end of the day, just as how capital requires quality, which is the interest rate which protects it, labor too requires qualitative protection, which is where the fairness of provisioning is equally relevant. Our entire focus, I think, in the neoclassical and the neoliberal era has been to secure capital and flight of capital. And we've been always trying to downsize the quality of labor market construction itself. So even when we may be worried about job creation, we are not worried about qualitative job creation. And the moment we, as labor economists, start saying that qualitative compulsions are there, that's when these contradictory questions come in. How can we manage the cost of labor, rigidity, etc., come in? Capital has become more rigid than labor is what we need to understand. I think the very fact that countries are competing in reducing their interest rates so that capital remains with them clearly indicates how rigid capital is, right? So if we can look after capital, I think we need to start talking about labor, not just, as you said, they are humans, yes, but at the fact of the matter, look at the quantum and the qualitative issues in the fairness debate and not be driven by the equality dimension directly. I would just go straight away to the MSME question, because we've been focusing a lot on these concerns even in our micro studies. Even if you look at the numbers of the MSMEs per se, India has historically been a proprietorship defined sector. Okay, the very fact that we get this capacity where individuals can register enterprises, start with a home-based worker, and I think in the morning we were talking about paid and unpaid worker, and then hire one person. I think we have always been micro. I think the word micro, small, and medium needs to get broken down. Where is our lens going to be? And I think during the COVID-19 pandemic time, that came out, that structural difference came out immediately in front of us. It was the medium scale enterprises which were able to at least recover partially. It was the small and the micro which shut down. And that's where the job creations are taking place. So whether we, this tendency to aggregate all the three categories together, I think is a fundamental flaw, and we need to now talk about them as independent spaces where jobs of a certain kind and labor of a certain type and product market of a certain type is taking place. An underlying belly problem, what product markets are connected where and what type of domestic consumption are being done across is also to be dealt with when we are talking about large scale policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will bring this session to a close. I thought that we would ask some questions and we'll have some answers from both of them, but there is no time for that. So I'll just conclude with three remarks. First, I think because I do not work in this area, but as an economist, I have written that production function. So I have a basic question is that what is labor reform? Normally we think labor reform is to be about the labor. But it is not only about the labor, it is also about the farm. Because if you if you take too much of hard position on the justice part of the labor, please remember that the farm also employs capital, and the farm wants a minimum return on the capital. And sometimes when you are a listed farm, you have to give that return not to the farm, but to the shareholders of the farm. So if you do not protect that capital, then the capital will simply not come. And then, therefore, it is not such an easy problem through injustice. You have to also look at the interest of the farm. Number two, look at the US versus Japan. I mean, there is one set of, US, for example, has a free market where you can fire everybody like which Elon Musk and, Zuckerberg are doing, versus a Japan where a laborer gets a lifetime contract. Now, these are very diametrically opposite, right? In one first case, the farm is transferring the entire risk to the labor. However, that is followed up by a very good social security system. On the other hand, there is another one which gives you a lifetime contract, but then some subsidy must flow from the government to the farm, because otherwise the farm will be getting the entire risk. So this is something we have to think. And thirdly is that if we push farm, because I'm really talking from the other side, because because I'm sure the labor economists will defend the other side, and SDG goals will also are there. For example, if we push the farms too much, then what will finally happen is all the labor is slowly from we already have an informal sector and a formal sector. Within formal sector, we have employment, and then we have contractual labor, because jobless growth. I mean, it is not that you cannot produce output without any labor. It is impossible. So therefore, what is happening is the formal labor is going into a contract labor, and you just cannot account for that. So yeah, if we push it, and finally, I think another thing that requires a huge attention is the platform workers, because we have been thinking about only manufacturing economies. However, nowadays it is driven by service sector, and look at all in Zomato and Zepto and whatever not. I mean, we'll give you delivery in 5 minutes, 5 seconds, 3 seconds. I'm cooking and I have forgotten the tomato sauce. I'll just call Zepto. He will come and give it before the tomato sauce is due to be given in the recipe, which is very good for me, but not very good for the laborer. And that sector is completely unregulated, growing at an exponential rate. And we must think about that the section also. So with that, I will stop this session and we'll go.
Thank you, panelists. Such a fantastic session, power-packed, full of information and lots to chew on. May I please request our Dean and Director, Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani, to come up on stage and felicitate the panelists. I would also request Dr. Vishal Dagar to come up on stage and be felicitated by the director. Professor Subrata Sen, Sarkar, sorry. Dr. Radhika Kapoor, Dr. Sandhya Iyer, and Dr. Vishal Dagar. In the interest of time, we will have all the parallel tracks of track 4 after lunch and the parallel tracks of track 5 thereafter. Okay. So 45 minutes lunch, yeah.